Welcome to InflexionPoint Podcast, where our mantra is cultivating change from the inside out. Join your hosts, Anita Russell, Mavis Bauman, and Gail Hunter, as we create a brave space for conversations about racism, personal transformation, and accountability. Conversation provides a means to dive deeply into your thoughts, ideas, and beliefs, and examine what emerges in your words, actions, and behaviors. The show is a journey towards anti-racism by cultivating change within yourself first and then out into the world. Learn to engage in racial dialogue using 4 tools: courage, conversation, relationship, and accountability. Discover how truth, reconciliation, and healing can emerge from honest and deliberate conversations. Manifest social change right now on InflexionPoint Podcast. So welcome to the newest episode of InflexionPoint Podcast, where our mantra is cultivating change from the inside out. I'm your host, Anita Russell, and here's a quick hello from co-hosts Mavis and Gail.
Hello, I'm Mavis Bauman. I'm so excited about our conversation tonight. We're going to learn something interesting. I'm betting on it.
Hi, my name is Gail Hunter, and I'm very excited to be here and to be part of this whole transformation from within. Thank you.
So together, the 3 of us make up the InflexionPoint Anti-Racism Mastermind Groups, and we are your guides on a journey towards anti-racism. And every episode, we have a new topic. And so the topic for this evening is the evolution of the Cairo question. And the question of the hour is, will Cairo have to protest in his lifetime for the birthright to freely and peacefully exist in the skin in which he was born? And we're going to explore that question in multiple contexts, such as lived experiences and protesting and birthright. But before we jump into the discussion, I'd like you to meet Cairo. So Cairo is my grandson, and he will be 2 years old in March. So here's just a quick video just for you to meet Cairo. So let me tell you about the backstory of the Cairo question. It basically started with a family discussion. So you may, if you've heard me speaking, you may have heard me share this story before, but it all started back in May of 2020. Specifically, it was June, actually, when we had this conversation. But there were 2 things that happened prior to this particular family conversation, and it was the birth of Cairo. So Cairo was born in March of 2020. So he's a COVID baby, if you will. And in May of 2020, we all witnessed the murder of George Floyd by Derek Chauvin. And my daughters in very early June were preparing for a Black Lives Matter protest. I have 2 daughters, and they were preparing for a Black Lives Matter protest in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And I kind of walked into the room where my younger daughter, Olivia, was sitting, and she's the mother of Cairo. And she had a kind of a solemn, kind of concerned look on her face. And I could tell that she was really thinking about something. And so we had a conversation. And in that conversation, we kind of talked about the fact that in our family, each of us represented a generation of protesting. And so it started with my mom. My mom was an activist, and then it moved to my generation. So when I was had some experiences with a merger, and so there were protests around that, and then protesting when I was in college, and that sort of thing. And then now I'm having this conversation with my daughters, who is now representing the third generation in my family of protesting. And so that was a very poignant moment. And she asked me if I thought that her son, Cairo, then at that time, just a 3-month-old baby, would have to protest in his lifetime. And so that kind of took me aback for a second or two. And so I had to really, really think about that question and what that question meant to me, because then that means he would be the fourth generation of my family protesting. And I don't want that to be Cairo's life. I don't want that to be what Cairo has to deal with in his life. And so out of that conversation, a couple of things happened over the course of about the next year or so. The first one is that I wrote a book, and I wrote a book called Cultivating Change from the Inside Out. And that book is kind of the foundation of this podcast, InflexionPoint Podcast, where we talk about this whole idea of manifesting change in the outer world by starting with yourself. And so I'd like to read a quick quote from that book that addresses the Cairo question. And it's on the dedication page of the book. It is dedicated to my grandsons, Zane and Cairo, whose lives I pray will be free from the need to protest for their right to exist as humans in Black skin, and whose dreams will not be systematically broken or deferred. And so I'm in a place now where that Cairo question has been a driver for many things in my life. And we're going to dive into that conversation. We're going to do a station break in a minute or two, and we're going to dive into that question, Mavis, Gail, and I. So Mavis and Gail, we have like another 2 minutes or so. Just tell me, our audience, very quickly, when you first heard me ask that question, how did that resonate with you?
For me, it just hit me in my core as a woman thinking about my children, that I would have to worry generation after generation, and what that must be like for you. I mean, I don't have children, but I could still feel that vulnerability and that legacy of being afraid for your children.
When I first heard it, it just tore to my core too. And I can't imagine having to say that to your son or grandson. I mean, it seems almost ridiculous and impossible that still exists in this day.
Yeah.
Yes. So we're going to dive into that conversation a little bit deeper. But for now, we're going to take a quick break. And when we return, we're going to talk a little bit about the historical evolution of the Cairo question. So stay tuned, and we'll be right back. So welcome back. At this point in our conversation, we're going to explore this idea of generational protesting a little bit deeply. And so when you think about the whole issue of protesting, there's a whole entire history behind that. And I had recently read an article from The Root. The Root, it's an online magazine. And it's an article that kind of gives this chronology going all the way back to like 1669, in that time frame, all the way up until the murder of George Floyd. And so when I sat down and read that article, and it just goes through and it talks a lot about uprisings, slave revolts, and things of that nature, again, going back historically, but it weaves its way all the way up through some of the things that we've experienced in the last, 10 years or so, with people being murdered, walking down the street, people sitting in their home and somebody bursting into their apartment and killing them, Travon Martin, Breonna Taylor. I could go on and on with all of the names. And so for me, the point that is being made in the Root article is, at what point in time do we as a community just get to say enough is enough? Like, how many more people do we have to watch on video camera? How many more times do we have to see these Amy Cooper incidents, or Philando Castile incidents, or a Tatiana Jackson, and all of these different things? Like, how many of those do we have to endure and watch before we can just say enough is enough? And I believe that we are in that point right now, in that space, in that time, that inflection point where enough is enough. So Mavis and Gail, what do you think when you think about, the protesting that you may or may have not done in your life? Tell me about your experiences from that standpoint, and looking at that, are we at that place where enough is enough?
I think we've been at that place where enough needs to be enough. I mean, I can remember in the late 60s and mid to late 60s and early 70s protesting about many different things, and civil rights was one of the big ones, not just the Vietnam War. And I've been kind of waiting for the next generation and the next generation to get back and protesting. And what's so sad is it's taken technology to actually allow everybody to recognize and to see and notice what's been going on forever. Right? Mm-hmm. And so it's more than enough time. It's beyond that time.
Okay, so just to continue the conversation, and to our audience, I apologize, but there's always some kind of technical thing that can happen. And so I wanted to kind of actually call out some of the stuff in this article, but I'm going to start more in like the 1900s, just to kind of give us a little bit more perspective onto what we're dealing with today. So we could take it back to the Red Summer of 1919, where there were numerous white mobs that just kind of came together and attacked Black communities, Tulsa, Oklahoma being one of them, Georgia, Atlanta specifically. And it was just this time period where there was all of these massacres on Black communities and things of that nature. And then in 1955, we had the death of Emmett Till. Then in 1961, we had the attack on the Freedom Riders. 1963 is when Dr. King did his I Have a Dream speech. Then we had the 16th Street Baptist church bombing in Birmingham, where 4 girls, Addie Mae Collins, Cynthia Wesley, Carol Robertson, and Denise McNair, were in that bombing, and they were killed in that bombing. Rodney King, Sean Bell, Travon Martin, Eric Gardner, Mike Brown, Tamir Weiss, Walter Scott. As I said earlier, we can just go on and on and on with all of these names, Philando Castile, Abdul Diallo. I mean, there's just so many people. And when you look at all of that collectively, because I've had people ask me, and I've had like white people ask me, well, why does there have to be so much protesting? And why is there violence at the protests? And why does this happen? And why does that happen? But again, if you look at that cumulative history over the course of generations and over the course of centuries, again, at what point do we as Black people get to just stand up and say enough is enough? and do something different. So Mavis, I want you to have the chance to kind of give a little bit of a perspective on how you see that.
Are you referring to my protesting history?
Well, however that resonates with you.
Because I've been thinking a lot about this, and I have never protested. I have never been near a protest. I've never been invited to a protest. I lived in New York City for a while and heard them, and I had to face the fact today that I don't think I ever thought they had anything to do with me. I never understood what protests were about. I thought that they just had to do with just people who were willing to express their anger. And so with the question you were just asking about how much is enough, if I had been through 1/100th of what you just listed, I know that that anger would just boil over. And so there's got to be a place for it to go. It's long been enough, long been enough. And it also made me wonder why I didn't get involved and what am I willing to do? You know, am I willing to protest and risk whatever the consequences are? It's just such a foreign experience to me. But I would say, you know, at least intellectually, I completely understand why this would happen. But I don't think a lot of white people really do. We don't understand how old it is, how old the anger is. It's not today. It's not last week. It's a long time ago.
Right.
So, yeah.
Right. So we have a tendency sometimes to think about these things as discrete points in time, but it's actually a continuum. So it's been this continuum, and I'm looking through my notes, and I want to go back and correct myself because I may have misspoke on Tatiana's name. Her name was Tatiana Jefferson, and out of respect for her, I want to make sure that I'm saying her name properly and correctly. So, but just getting back to the discussion, now maybe it's one of the things that you mentioned is the fact that there's anger. So Gail, I'd like you at this point to talk a little bit more about it being a lot more than just anger from a trauma perspective, from a generational trauma perspective. So there's a lot of pain and there's a lot of hurt. So it's not just about anger. So if Gail, if you could talk about that a little bit, that would be awesome.
I look at anger that's made up of the emotions of fear and pain of some variation. And so if all you see is the anger, then you're missing the core pieces of what that anger is about. But you look at the generation after generation of the truth of what has happened to Black people when they were first brought over and continue to happen to them, even through the civil rights movement in the 60s to back to the Civil War even. There was still so much racism going on and so much discrimination that the anger built up in the present comes from all those past generations and all the moments in that person's personal life and the collective life, right? And so when I work with trauma survivors or survivors of domestic violence, and having been a survivor of domestic violence, I remember when we all have a limit, right? We don't know where that limit is or when that limit is going to happen, but we all have a limit to what we will tolerate. And usually that means we've gone way beyond that limit. And when George Floyd was killed, murdered in front of everybody because of the video and the technology that we have, that was a limit.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
that was definitely a minute. So,
and so the
it's almost time. Yeah, go ahead, Gail. Go ahead.
Yeah, and the anger that came, the was filled with deep pain and fear. Is this ever going to change? And so you ask the question about Cairo, is this ever going to change? And time is now.
Yes, yes. So I think it's time for us to take a break, and so we can come back, but I'd like to continue that conversation, particularly around this aspect of generational trauma. Okay, so welcome back, and we're going to continue the conversation. And right now we're kind of talking about the purpose of protesting and what's behind the protesting, what's the history and that sort of thing. And I want Gail to continue, but before you do, I want to read a quick quote from that Root article that I had brought up earlier. Without the proper context, it is impossible to understand the mushroom cloud of uprisings that are exploding across the country in the wake of the deaths of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and countless others.
Yeah. So Anita, if it's okay, I just want to expand on the comment I just made. I mean, just for people like me who don't know much about the Black experience in the States, and the whole idea of being a racist and having racist beliefs, when I talked about the protests as angry, that was a perfect example. That was a perfect example of reflecting what I heard on the news, what I felt without the proper context, right? I didn't have a context for it. So the beautiful thing about this conversation is I get to learn live about that stuff. And to ignore the fear and pain in my comment, I just need to own that. So take it away, Gail.
Thank you, Mavis.
Well, what's interesting is when you look at the protests that were violent, most of the violence was started by white people. And it was interfering with the peaceful protesting that was actually going on. And so it's easy to hear one thing from one news and another from another, but unless you really look at the whole reality and see the videos, you're not going to look and see that truth. And I believe we have to start looking and seeing that truth. And the names that you have listed, Anita, there are probably hundreds more and hundreds more, right? Just in the last 5 years or 10 years. That should never be on that list.
Because there are a lot of incidents that we don't necessarily hear about. And so just looking at all of this as this time continuum and kind of getting to this place where we are now in 2021, getting ready to go into 2022, we are in that inflection point where things can either go in this way, a positive direction, and Cairo won't have to protest, or they can go in another way. And I think going whichever way it goes is going to be dependent upon people sitting down and having conversations, genuine, authentic conversations about where we are and where would we like to see ourselves in the future. And so I'd like to kind of continue this conversation, but also kind of looking at it from the standpoint of where would you like the future? Like if you could envision 15 years from now, and I specifically use 15 years because I met a gentleman that started another organization that does work that's kind of similar to this, having that uncomfortable truth. And it's called a long talk about an uncomfortable truth. And one of the things, the gentleman's name is Kyle, believe Kyle Williams, but one of the things that I really liked about their approach is that they actually have this timeline, or this endpoint, I should say, where they want to do this work so that in 15 years, racism will be eradicated. And so when I think about that 15 years, and I think about Cairo, because in 15 years or so, Cairo will be just about 17, the age of Travon Martin. And what will things look like for him 15 years from now? And how are we going to get there? And one of the other things that really kind of rings in my mind as I think about that is where we are now having these conversations is where the dismantling of racism is happening. So you're dismantling it and you're able to break it apart and look at all of the pieces. What are the lessons that we can learn from the things that we've experienced over all of these centuries and generations? What can we learn so that we can put our faith in a different future? And so what does that mean to you, putting your faith in a different future?
We find hope. It's where we find belief and trust and love and all the things I think that we all are seeking, right? Where racism isn't even an issue. It's not even a thought. You know? It's what was, it's not what is.
Yeah. And so when I think about what you just said, the idea of really imagining what this country or this world could look like if racism truly was eradicated, that's a powerful thing to try to imagine and try to envision, because it's so embedded in like all of our lives. It's just embedded there. Mm-hmm. And so what are some of the things that we'll have to talk about, that we'll have to do as we begin to move forward away from the place where we are and into something completely different?
I think, if it's okay if I go now, I think that we white people need to just know a lot more about the experience. I think I talked early on about a friend of mine who said, I never walk out of my house without thinking about the color of my skin. Mm-hmm. And so in 15 years, I would love for every, brown skinned person in the world to be able to say, I don't have to think about it. I mean, that's just a really basic thing, to be able to move about, to feel safe, to not feel judged as you often say, as a monolith, to be stereotyped. All of those things would be sort of a substrate for getting other work done, like changing laws and changing our educational system and so on. That's what I would love to see.
And we're kind of in a battle right now. In a lot of ways, we're in a battle to do exactly what you're describing, because this is not an easy battle. This is not going to be easy at all. All you have to look at is the political, what's happening in the political arenas and things like that. One of the things that I sort of, in putting this program together and thinking about what would an activism through coaching model actually look like. And so I started off by just saying that I truly believe that in addition to changes in laws and legislation or politics and economics, that change has to happen at the individual level. It has to happen at that personal level. So maybe it's just to ask you a question to piggyback off of something that you said. It's one thing for a white person to begin to know and be aware of the history, but is just knowing and awareness, is that enough? And just knowing, and is that really putting your faith in a different future, or is there more to it than that?
Well, I think there's a lot more to it, because the awareness is really just a waking up. It's not action. It's not changing anything in the world. It's not even necessarily changing your own behavior. So just, as you and Gail and the listeners are witnessing my journey in this, I have to think about, my own heart. What are my reactions when I see brown skin? What are those reactions? How can I uproot those things in a way that would change, as Gail says, the vibration around, that people would just interact differently in groups. I might have got off the trail there a little bit. Did that answer your question?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's fine. That's fine.
Okay. Basically, just it's the inside job part, and I'm such a strong believer in small steps at the individual level, and how at the grassroots level we can make this change. I argued plenty with Gail and Anita both about the 15-year goal, and I'm just too practical about it. We have to be really, audacious about it, and just really acknowledge what we're carrying around that we don't even know. We don't even know. We have to open our hearts to those beliefs and acknowledge them. I think that's the most difficult part for me. I keep wanting to hide. It's just a natural thing. I'm ashamed or embarrassed, and it's nothing that well, see, I'm already covering myself, but I kind of want to hide. It's not my thing, to come with.
Right.
Yeah.
So Gail, from your perspective as a therapist, and you're listening to Mavis, what is your reaction to what she's saying?
I think what she's saying is pretty normal. I think when people begin to break through a little bit of that awareness, that what comes up is that feeling of shame, or that wanting to go back into that denial because it hurts, and we feel a sense of guilt or remorse or awareness just of our own inner racism that we're not even consciously aware of, but it's still there from generational and accumulation of imprints that happen to us. But we have to awaken to that. We cannot change this without changing our own personal belief system. And we can't change that until we are aware of it, until what's really there. Just as I may have said before that we were doing a workshop with Oma, and what came out of my mouth was talking about being the black sheep of my family. And the second I said that, I thought, oh my God, that's it, right? That imprint from generations, right? Of that word black meaning something bad, when it's just a color as any other color is, right? Yet that imprint was still there. And I was aware of it, but it still came out of me. And so it's the openness and willingness to listen to yourself, to really look within, to check in with what you've learned and what you still are holding as if it's true. Instead of reframing it and changing that belief system to allow for your thoughts and feelings and behavior to begin to change.
Yes, yes. So it's time for yet another break. And when we return, we're going to kind of finish out this conversation and just talk a little bit more about our work and how others can get involved in this conversation. So before we went on break, Gail was kind of getting into some conversation about those beliefs that are kind of buried within us. So Gail, I'd like you to kind of finish out your thought, if you would.
Yeah, I mean, I think that to make any change with our behavior or our thoughts or feelings, we have to listen and look within to see what our belief system says. What do I believe? What am I holding attachment to in truth? And truth resonates when you are able to say it and you feel it. And something that is not true also will resonate in a different vibrational frequency, in a lower vibrational frequency. And so it's painful to look in that mirror and say, this is what I have to look at and what I have to own. When I've worked with not just survivors of domestic violence, but even perpetrators, the abusers, one of the things that when they were able to break through that denial and start seeing the truth of how they were behaving and treating the person they said they loved, it was so painful that most of them became very depressed and suicidal until they broke back into denial. And so how easy that is, because it's so painful within us. If you look at the accurate history of what has happened, how Black people actually came here, and the whole truth around all of that isn't taught in the school systems, then we have to look and own that those beliefs get trickled down. I mean, in my family, my older sister was very racist. My parents were somewhat racist, but very respectful about it. I'll put that in quotes, right? That they didn't really talk about it. And so it's easy to hide behind that. But just as I had to recognize it in that moment that I shared, that I said that word black sheep, I had to own that and start looking a little bit deeper as where's that coming from? And so we have to look at those belief systems, as painful as that may be. And many people say, it's not me, I didn't do anything. But you carry some of that with you. We all do. You can't be white in this country and not have some of that.
Yeah, go ahead, Mavis.
Oh, I was just thinking along the lines of what Gail was saying about how trauma is passed down. The beliefs about what happened are passed down in unspoken ways. As I've said, I just can't point to specific teachings that have caused me to believe what I believe, but it's been passed down, maybe a lot of it non-verbally. And so, yes, it's just hard to acknowledge. It's just hard to acknowledge. I want to do it. We just have to do it.
Right. And there's so much. There's
so
just
much.
so much. It's just
Yeah.
mind blowing and
Yeah.
all of that. So one of the things that were not able to dig into, and I think I'm just going to defer this particular topic to the next time we get together, and that's this topic of birthright. And so when you look at the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, when you look at the Declaration of Independence, when you look at, it was another document that I had found, it's called the Black Declaration of Independence, and it was written in 1970, and it was issued and signed on July 4th of 1970 by members of the National Committee of Black Churchmen. And it's worded very similarly to what is in the Declaration and what is in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So we're going to dig deeply into that, because the truth of the matter is all of this stuff that we're talking about is really rooted in humanity. It's rooted in our humanity. That is the common theme in all of these preambles, if you will, that we all have these inalienable rights endowed to us by our Creator. But we walk through the world with these systems and these institutions in place that deny certain groups of people those very inalienable rights. And so it's just really interesting that, I think we're in a place where we do have to start digging more deeply in what are the foundations and what are the things that this nation was built upon, and how does that really ring true when you think about it in terms of lived experiences.
Yeah. And Anita, when I read that about the Black Declaration of Rights, I may not have the title right, I looked at it and I thought, what has changed since 1970? Really? That's upsetting. That is upsetting. I mean, we have written things that are kind of pushed, like, inclusion and diversity and so on. But I shouldn't speak to that as a whole, but I feel like conversations like this are going to uncover much, much more than forced dialogue in unnatural situations.
Mm-hmm.
When you get to talk to a friend who you can trust, or a number of friends, then there's real movement.
Mm-hmm. And we are literally just about out of time. And I wanted to just kind of talk to the audience and tell them how they can join this conversation that we're having. You can email question to InflexionPoint Podcast via Transformational Talk Radio. You can visit theplacetosoar.com. I have a dismantling racism quiz that you can take. And then there's also a discovery call, because I am running a social impact mastermind. And if you want to sit down and have a conversation with me about the possibility of becoming a part of that, you can do it, theplacetosoar.com. So Mavis and Gail, if you could just do a quick shout out on your organizations as well.
Okay. My organization, Seed a Better Life, is about helping people in Rwanda who were affected by the genocide. And my founding principle was do something, and that small acts change lives. If we apply that in this discussion, in this challenge in our society, we can make substantial change. So I just encourage everyone to think about the small acts they take every day, that they can change the way we are together. The way we are together. So feel free to go to my site, seedabetterlife.org, and check it out.
Okay, great. We lost you for like a second, a couple seconds there, Mavis. Yeah. So Gail, if you could just talk a little bit about OMA.
I sure will. OMA is, you can reach OMA at www.omapittsburgh.org. And OMA stands for the Ohio, Monongahela, and Allegheny Rivers. Where the two rivers come to create the third river, the Ohio. It's supposedly a vortex, a very spiritual place in nature. So my vision originated in the awareness that all people, I believe, had a right to heal from any trauma or experience that they've had in life. And they should have the ability to access holistic treatment and therapy, just in spite of whatever their financial backgrounds are, their social, cultural, racial, whatever. So what we've done is we have monthly lecture series where we highlight holistic practitioners, and now it's on Zoom. We also have child and adolescent programs, program during the summer, and trying to create an after-school program in the east end of Pittsburgh. We also offer trauma-sensitive training to educators, to parents, to community members, and anyone that's interested. And we also do workshops, and one of them was Anita's workshop, mastermind workshop on transformation, on anti-racism. And I have to tell you, if you get a chance to look into this, please do, because it was one of the most eye-opening and self-awareness experiences that I have had. And it is very valuable if you're going to step into this place of transformation and changing those beliefs.
Excellent, excellent. So I'm just going to call out all those websites again. We got theplacetosoar.com, we got seedabetterlife.org, and we got omapittsburgh.org. And great work happens in all of these organizations. And when we get back together in our next discussion, we're going to tackle that birthright question. So what I want to leave our audience with is this. Are you willing to put your faith in a different future for the sake of Cairo and others just like him? And so just kind of ponder that question until we get together again, and just continue the conversation. Any final words, Mavis and Gail?
I'm going to the Apple store. It's going to be better next time. Patience, everybody.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's yeah.
And thank you, Anita.
Of course. So, and obviously, thank you for the people who have tuned in and the people who will be catching the replay. Definitely send us some comments. Like I said, you can send an email to InflexionPoint Podcast via transformationtalkradio.com, and we can kind of continue the conversation. Thank you for listening to Inflection Point Podcast, where our mantra is cultivating change from the inside out. The journey towards anti-racism and social change doesn't stop here. Truth, reconciliation, and healing come from ongoing, open, honest, and deliberate conversations. Continue to dive in and deconstruct your thoughts, ideas, and beliefs as we band together to manifest social change. Tune in to Inflection Point Podcast every first and third Wednesday at 3 p.m. Pacific, 6 p.m. Eastern, here on TransformationTalkRadio.com for more conversations about how we can cultivate change from the inside out.